Hi guys, when you hear the name Brian Wilson, what comes to mind? Maybe it's the surf rock harmonies of the Beach Boys, the sun-drenched nostalgia of California, or the unmistakable sound of God Only Knows drifting through an open window on a summer day. But behind those golden melodies is a man whose life was anything but sunny. This is the story of a genius. A fragile, brilliant mind who reshaped modern music, then disappeared into silence. And it all begins in Hawthorne, California. Brian Douglas Wilson was born on June 20, 1942. He was the eldest of 3 boys, and from the very beginning, it was clear he wasn't like other kids. His ears were sharp, sharper than most adults. By the age of 2, he could hum melodies he'd only heard once. By 7, he was harmonizing with the radio like it was second nature. But childhood wasn't easy. His father, Murray Wilson, was a failed musician and a man ruled by bitterness and control. Murray was abusive, both physically and emotionally. He believed in tough love, heavy on the tough, light on the love. And while that fractured Brian in some ways, it also lit a fire inside him. By his teens, Brian was obsessed with sound. He could hear entire symphonies in his head. He was fascinated with vocal harmony and obsessed with the 4 freshmen. He studied their complex arrangements, mimicked them, and built upon them. He began writing songs, not simple tunes, but layered, emotional pieces that carried the weight of someone far older. Then came the moment everything changed. It was 1961. Brian, his younger brothers Carl and Dennis, his cousin Mike Love, and a neighborhood friend, Al Jardine, formed a band. They called themselves the Pendletons, but that name didn't last. Their label changed it without asking. They would become the Beach Boys. And just like that, the sound of a generation was born. The Beach Boys exploded onto the scene with songs about surfing, girls, and California dreams. But behind the scenes, it was Brian who crafted the music. He wasn't just a member, he was the engine. He arranged the harmonies, wrote the songs, and eventually began producing the records himself. At just 20 years old, Brian Wilson was taking full control of a major American band. No one else was doing that at the time. No one else could. But there was a cost. As the Beach Boys toured endlessly, Brian stayed behind. He hated flying, hated the chaos. So he left the stage to focus on what he loved, creating music in the studio. And what he created wasn't just music, it was alchemy. He began working with session musicians known as the Wrecking Crew, seasoned pros who had played on hits for Frank Sinatra and Phil Spector. Brian pushed them. He demanded odd time signatures, strange instruments, unconventional structures. They'd never seen anything like it. And in 1966, it all came together. Pet Sounds. An album that changed everything. Gone were the surf anthems and teenage fantasies. In their place were orchestral arrangements, haunting melodies, and raw emotion. It was deeply personal, filled with melancholy and longing. Songs like, I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, revealed a man isolated even in his success. Critics loved it. Paul McCartney would later say that, Pet Sounds, inspired the Beatles to make Sgt. Pepper. But the public? They weren't ready. Sales were modest. Some fans were confused. The rest of the Beach Boys weren't thrilled. And Brian? He was devastated. He had poured his soul into the music, and it felt like the world hadn't noticed. Still, he wasn't finished. He had something even bigger in mind. An album called Smile. It would be his masterpiece. A teenage symphony to God, he called it. But something was unraveling. The pressure. The expectations. The constant voice in his head telling him it wasn't enough. Brian began slipping away from reality. He became paranoid. Anxious. He was hearing voices. He was self-medicating with LSD and amphetamines. The once confident producer now second-guessed every note. And the band? They pushed back. Smile was too weird, too ambitious. They wanted hits, not symphonies. The project collapsed. Brian retreated. He stopped going to the studio. Stopped writing. Some days, he barely got out of bed. His weight ballooned. His eyes were vacant. He wandered the halls of his mansion like a ghost of the man he used to be. And for a long time, that's all he was, a ghost. Then came the wilderness years, the lost decades when Brian Wilson, once the brightest mind in pop music, became a recluse inside his own mind. Throughout the 1970s, Brian drifted further and further from the world. His genius, once unstoppable, now seemed like a memory. While the Beach Boys struggled to stay relevant in a world moving past surf music, Brian faded into the background, living in his bedroom, isolated, sedated, and forgotten. Friends and family didn't recognize him. He would stay in bed for days, refusing to bathe, barely speaking. His once razor-sharp ear dulled by years of substance abuse and untreated mental illness. There were stories, disturbing ones, of Brian being so out of touch with reality that he would dig holes in his backyard or talk to his food. He was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, but even that couldn't fully explain the complexity of what he was battling. By the late 70s, the Beach Boys were a band in name only. Brian was credited on albums, but his involvement was minimal, often orchestrated by others trying to cash in on his name. He was more a myth than a man, the genius who cracked. But in 1983, a new chapter began, one just as controversial as the darkness that preceded it. Enter Eugene Landy, a psychologist with radical methods and a reputation for saving lost celebrities. He was brought in to rehabilitate Brian, but what started as therapy quickly became control. Landy isolated Brian from his friends and family, put him on a strict regime of medications, diet, and productivity, and inserted himself into every part of Brian's life. It was extreme. And it worked, for a while. Brian lost weight. He began working again, performing publicly and even writing new songs. For many, it looked like a comeback. In 1988, Brian released his first true solo album. Tracks like Love and Mercy reminded the world what he was capable of, fragile, emotional, profoundly human music that reached into the soul. But the shadow of Landy loomed large. Landy was more than a therapist, he became Brian's manager, co-writer, even legal guardian. He made creative decisions, took royalties, and controlled Brian's medications. He was even listed as a co-producer on songs he didn't write. It wasn't just manipulation, it was exploitation. By the early 90s, Brian's family and legal team fought back. In 1992, a court officially severed Landy's control, banning him from contacting Brian ever again. And slowly, Brian began to reclaim his life, this time, on his own terms. The 90s were still rough. Brian was fragile, and though free from Landy, he remained haunted by his past. But he kept working. He toured, sometimes shakily, but always with heart. He collaborated with other artists, cautiously stepping back into the world of music he once dominated. Then, something remarkable happened. In the early 2000s, Brian did what no one thought he would, he returned to Smile. The abandoned masterpiece that had nearly destroyed him was still living in his mind, and now, he was ready to finish it. With help from a dedicated band and a supportive team, Brian reconstructed Smile from scratch. He performed it live to standing ovations. And in 2004, he released the completed album. It was triumphant. The Teenage Symphony to God was finally real, and it was everything fans had hoped for. It wasn't just a music event, it was a cultural redemption. Brian Wilson, the fallen genius, had done the impossible. He had come full circle. Over the next decade, Brian kept creating. He released new albums, some joyful, some introspective. He collaborated with younger artists, bridging generations through music. He toured worldwide, sometimes shaky on stage, but always sincere, always himself. And slowly, the narrative began to shift. Brian Wilson was no longer just the tortured genius of the 60s. He was a survivor. A man who had walked through fire and come out the other side, scarred, yes, but still holding a melody. In interviews, he remained quiet, awkward, and often hard to follow. But when asked about his music, a spark would ignite. "Music is in my soul," he would say. "It's all I have." Fans around the world connected deeply with that vulnerability. Brian wasn't a rock god, he was human. He represented something rarely seen in popular music, truth. In his struggle, people saw their own. And in his recovery, they found hope. There's something magical about watching a man who was once lost find his way back, not to fame, but to purpose. And even as he aged, Brian never stopped dreaming. In 2015, he released No Peer Pressure, an album about memory, loss, and the passing of time. It was gentle, bittersweet, and unmistakably Brian. That same year, the biopic Love and Mercy hit theaters, telling the story of his life, both the brilliance and the darkness. It introduced a new generation to his legacy. But even then, as applause filled the rooms, as tributes poured in, a question lingered in the air. How long could Brian keep going? The man who gave us Good Vibrations had spent most of his life in chaos. How do you carry that weight forever? The final chapter of Brian Wilson's story is one marked by quiet reverence, reflection, and a sense of collective awe. As the years passed, the music world began to realize just how rare his kind of genius was, and how much of it we almost lost. In his later years, Brian became something of a mythical figure, often seen but rarely heard. He toured occasionally, sitting at the piano with a small smile, surrounded by musicians who knew they weren't just playing songs, they were helping a legend speak. The notes that came from Brian's hands weren't perfect anymore, and his voice, once soaring and smooth, was weathered by time. But none of that mattered. Because when Brian Wilson sat down at the piano and began to play God Only Knows, it was like the universe held its breath. Every performance became an act of defiance. Against time. Against illness. Against a world that had too often misunderstood him. And the audiences understood that. They didn't come to see a rock star. They came to honor a man who had given them something eternal, music that lived in their hearts, memories that never faded. Still, time doesn't pause, even for the greats. In the 2020s, Brian's public appearances became increasingly rare. His health declined slowly but noticeably. Interviews became fewer. His social media updates, managed by his team, shared gentle updates, time with family, old photos, memories of songs past. Fans around the world began to brace themselves for the inevitable, knowing that someday soon, the world would lose Brian Wilson. And then, the day came. Brian Wilson passed away quietly, surrounded by loved ones. The announcement was simple, elegant, just like his music. But the grief was seismic. Across the globe, tributes poured in. From artists, from celebrities, from fans who had never met him but felt like they knew him. Music channels played Pet Sounds from beginning to end. Radio stations filled the air with Beach Boys harmonies. Fans gathered on beaches, lighting candles at sunset. But more than grief, there was gratitude. Gratitude for the songs that had shaped lifetimes. For the emotions he dared to write down. For the way he proved that vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was beauty. Brian Wilson didn't just soundtrack the American dream. He cracked it open and showed us the longing underneath. His passing wasn't just the loss of a music legend, it was the final note of an era. Brian had lived in a world of sound and feeling, and he gave us access to it. He took the innocence of youth, the ache of loneliness, the grandeur of love, and turned it all into harmony. He once said he heard voices in his head. What we didn't realize then was that those voices were music. Unfiltered. Untamed. Divine. And now, as the world moves forward without him, we are left with echoes. Echoes in the laughter of friends driving down a coastal highway. In the tears that fall during a wedding's first dance. In the quiet moments of solitude, when a Beach Boys song drifts out of a speaker and suddenly, everything feels okay. Brian Wilson never chased fame. He chased truth. And in doing so, he gave us some of the most beautiful sounds ever recorded. He taught us that it was okay to feel too much. That it's okay to be different. That sometimes, the most powerful voice in the room is the one that sings softly. So we remember him, not just as the genius behind the Beach Boys, or the mind that gave us Smile, but as a man who lived a life of staggering complexity and left behind a legacy of staggering beauty. In the end, Brian Wilson didn't need to explain himself. He said it all in his music. And in that music, he lives forever.